Good morning and welcome to all our attendees. I'm Nora Lockshin. I'm going to be kicking off today's sessions with Safekeeping Tomorrow, Part 1, Tools, Determination, Passion to Serve, Preserve, and Protect Our Future. I'm so impressed already with the talks I've seen, the presentations thus far, and I invite you all to visit and discover the archived talks as they represent a diverse array of persons and careers in this wide-ranging field of preservation. It's very encouraging to hear the calls for our future directions among emerging and already leaders in the field. I've heard a lot about a lot of different STEAM and STEM trades and academic disciplines, and there's so much more than even I think about in the scope of my work today. I welcome our panel, who are invited to turn their videos on at their discretion. On behalf of the panel, we come to you from various geographic regions today. And on behalf of the panel, we would like to gratefully acknowledge the Native peoples on whose ancestral homelands we gather, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their home here today, wherever you are. I'm coming to you from Baltimore City, where I've learned through friends and the work of Ashley Minner, a community artist, folklorist, and professor, an enrolled member of the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina, who have also made their home here in Baltimore City and elsewhere, Philadelphia. And I invite you to learn about their Ashley's work on behalf of the tribe and throughout the community. And I believe that will be pushed in the chat. Smithsonian Magazine did a nice write-up on her work earlier this year. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on the bios. Those are in the program for you. And the persons on this panel do represent their institutions as well as their own work. But to orient the audience, our distinguished panel represents a certain breadth of experience in the work and field of public history, preservation and conservation of art, archive, and library materials. We work with artwork, correspondence, diaries, books on paper, architectural records, audiovisual recorded history from analog to born digital records. These objects may be they may be unique originals or iterations. Some of these made years apart that describe changes or evolution of sites, places, things, people, and their deeds over time. What may surprise some of the audience is that we study and work across multiple technological innovations and formats of these media, from writings, drawings, reproduction processes, photographs, prints, and recordings on all manner of paper, polymers, glass, skins, metals. And these are fundamentally organic and inorganic objects of use that bear a story. The work that we do today provides longevity and access to collections that support the foundation and material history from historic sites, events, and the interpretation of same. A thread that we all have in common is that we all have a hand in adding value to knowledge about the collections and teaching colleagues and the emerging workforce, whether through mentorship in seminars or leading full academic courses. Some of us even do public presentations. With that, I'd like to allow the panelists to briefly introduce themselves. And I'm going to go in alphabetical order by first name. So Anna, if you would unmute yourselves, panelists.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm Anna Kaplan. I'm an independent historian and oral historian in Washington, D.C. I teach history courses at American University and the University of DC. I've worked on archival oral history projects with the Smithsonian and the National Park Service. I also work with the DC Oral History Collaborative, supporting local community oral history projects. And lastly, I co-chair the Oral History Association's Diversity Committee and am vice president of the Oral History in the Mid-Atlantic region. Thank you.
That'll be Renee.
Nora, I'm never second.
that change?
With Wolcott, I'm always last. Good morning, everyone. I'm Renee Wolcott. I'm the Assistant Head of Conservation and the Book Conservator at the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia, which was founded in 1743 by Benjamin Franklin, so it has a very strong colonial past. I'm very interested in the history of preservation and collections care as practiced at the APS, which includes many strong women actors as binders and restorers, going back to the early 19th century. Excuse me, I'm sorry for my allergies. I'm sipping my tea and trying to keep the frogs away, but they may intrude. I also continue to be engaged with the University of Delaware Winterthur Conservation Program, which I graduated from in 2011, teaching there occasionally, and I write a lot about conservation. So you can find information about my work in the chat. So I look forward to our panel today.
Shannon.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Shannon Brogdon-Grantham. I am the photograph and paper conservator at the Smithsonian's Museum Conservation Institute, which is one of the institution's 9 research centers. And I primarily focus on photograph conservation research, but I do also occasionally treat objects in the vast Smithsonian collections, specifically focusing on the units or the museum units that do not have my area of photographic conservation specialty, which there's only one unit that actually has that specialty. So I end up working very closely with many of the Smithsonian units, and in some instances, all of them. But my interests and focus since starting in the field of conservation have been on ways in which I can give back, either through mentoring, providing opportunities. I do lectures in the DC area and out of the DC area, sometimes partnered with local universities and other types of institutions. So I think of my role not only as a person who is preserving the Smithsonian's collections, but also helping to bring in the next generation of collections care professionals.
And Sylvia.
Hi, I'm Sylvia Albro, and I'm a senior paper conservator at the Library of Congress. I'm originally from California, but a graduate of the Cooperstown program, which was co-run by a woman, a very strong woman, Caroline Keck, who was probably the first of many that I worked with. And at the Library of Congress, I'm lucky enough to work with a very diverse community within the library as a whole, and within specialties, certainly in the conservation lab. We are a group of 40, so I'm one of a very big team. And my special interest has been training of interns. I've been there for 35 years and have really enjoyed working with interns and young people from all over the world. It's been a great pleasure for me. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you. You're already keyed into where we're going to go today. So again, I'm going to kick it off in alphabetical order. I'm going to be asking the panel some questions we've already sort of briefly discussed, but we've saved, a lot of our talking points for today so we can have an engaged and fluid conversation. I invite the audience to enter questions as we're going along into the Q&A box in the bottom of your Zoom webinar screen. I think Facebook folks will be following along. There may be service in the chat there, but we're concentrating on the Q&A box in the Zoom today. So please enter those and we'll address them at the end of this session. So I'm aiming to cover about 3 questions in about 10 minutes each. We're gonna do a round robin on the first question before we go on to the next one. So kicking off Safekeeping Tomorrow, I've asked you to reflect on the themes of our title, tools, determination, and passion, and to serve, preserve, and protect the past. What does that all mean? So kicking it off, thinking broadly in your experience about, and that you've been taught and not what you share today and do, what does the toolbox connotate? What tool do you use to serve, preserve, and protect the past? This could be metaphorical or the favorite tool that you inherited from someone as you pass from one lab or experience into the other. Anna.
I love this question, and particularly because it's kind of complicated for oral history, because oral history is both something to be preserved, but also a method or process of preserving itself. And oral history has a wide range of things that it preserves or that it seeks to preserve. And one of these is thinking about Indigenous cultures or cultures that are not text-based, and using oral history as a way to hold that knowledge and pass on knowledge of those cultures, their societies, their ways of understanding the world, and adapting them to current situations. And this is something that has not oftentimes been included in the sort of academic field of oral history, or this sort of defined Western field of oral history that is all focused on recording technology and writing down or recording people's experiences and their lived experiences and their history and knowledge and interpretation of that. And this is a conversation that I think is starting to happen within the US and internationally in terms of oral history, is how do we understand both of these approaches to oral history, this more sort of Western academic understanding, and also these traditional cultural understandings of oral history. For myself, I was trained in the oral history master's program at Columbia University, and they have been supporting a series of workshops on decolonizing and combating oppression in oral history and the uses of oral history. And this is a conversation that I am really interested in and look forward to seeing how it moves forward.
I guess I'll jump in. Thank you, Anna. That was wonderful. And it kind of ties in well with some of my thoughts on tools in the conservation profession. As a book conservator, of course, I'm working primarily, my sort of subject material, if you will, is books, which are a tool for conveying knowledge across immense spans of time sometimes. And my career prior to conservation was, I was an English major first. I was fascinated by books as repositories of information and stories. And I was interested in books because of their intellectual content. As a book conservator, I'm also interested in books because of their physical aspects. So they contain a lot of historical information that the average reader isn't aware of. So if you're looking at an old book, you're not only looking at words on paper or parchment, you're looking at the binder who produced the book, the animals whose skins were put into it, all the methods by which books were constructed in the day it was made. And so books are multifaceted tools of their own for understanding the past. And of course, when I'm working on books, I'm using physical tools in my hands. I have my favorite, Caselli spatula and my Teflon folder that are my go-to tools, physical tools. But I think the most important tools that I use in my job are actually other people, either because of what they've written and that I can access through professional literature. But even more than that, it's the professional and personal networks that we build. So, former colleagues, my former professors at Winterthur and the University of Delaware, everyone, all of us come to conservation with our own biases based on not only how we were raised and where that happened, but which program we went to, where we worked after that. My previous experience before coming to the APS was at a regional conservation center. So I was working both for institutions that sent materials in, but also private clients, each of whom had their own expectation for what complete work looked like. And that experience certainly has made me approach treatment in a different way from someone who has always worked in a library or always worked in a museum. So the tools I use to do my job best are actually consulting with others who have different experiences. And I think that diversity of approach to conservation is something that we are recognizing more and more as an important facet of the field. And one of the things that gives me great hope about the future of the field is that we are trying more and more to make it easier for people to access. There are many hurdles to becoming a conservator. Frequently, you have to do a lot of unpaid work to enter the field, and that isn't a possibility for everyone. And so we're trying to lower those hurdles so that we have more diverse experiences to draw on. And I think that's vital. We can't keep doing conservation the way it has always been done. And I will say in sort of closing that when I think about, excuse me, tools in particular, the people as tools, I mean, conservation is now a female-dominated field, whereas preservation and restoration in its early days was male-dominated. And I'm so grateful to the many women conservators who sort of pointed me in the right direction, taught me about the field before I even had my foot in the door, and gave so generously of their time and experience. And I think that's something that each of us has the opportunity to pass on to the next generation. That's something that I'm very excited about doing.
Thanks so much, Renee. Shannon?
Thanks, Renee and Anna. And I think you both have kicked it off really well. And I have, I guess, ideas and thoughts that complement both of what you all have said. So as a photograph conservator, I primarily work with, the visual records. So photography is such a ubiquitous medium that everyone in the world has at least one photograph. And so one thing that I always appreciated about my specialty and have always appreciated about photography is that it's a democratic art. It connects people. You cannot walk past an image of somebody without taking a pause to look at it. And that's something that I really have held on to since my first interest in photography before I found out about conservation, and I continue to hold on to it now. And it's a way for me to connect with colleagues, connect with artists, connect with living cultures. It's something that I think is very grounding in my work. And I'd have to say, like, the best tool, aside from the physical tools that I use to do conservation work, would be my eyes and my ears, being able to see and really take in something and hear what, especially if I'm working with a living community or a group of artists. Recently, I've been working on a photo quilt project with a group of local quilt artists who are in partnership with the Anacostia Community Museum. And this project, what we thought was going to be something that was just a couple of years project, maybe a 2-year project, into a multi-year project where we've been able to get these rich stories about the quilting techniques themselves, the artists themselves, and people who work in that community. And of course, quilting is definitely thought of as a woman's art or a woman's craft. And this group that we've been working with is called the Daughters of Dorcas and Sons. And they do actually have 2 sons that participate in the group, but they're primarily women. And so being around these individuals who, they don't know much about conservation from the traditional standpoint, but they do understand what it means to preserve something and what it means to actually protect and keep. And that is something that I've always valued about our field, but how it can translate to non-specialist individuals and how we're able to connect with those people. And so I think aside from the tools that I can use to actually do physical preservation of the work, there is a tremendous amount that I can glean by having these conversations and spending time understanding technique and process, which is a big part of what we do as conservators anyway. But actually getting out there on the ground and working with people, alongside people, and seeing what they're doing and how they understand their art and how they understand the techniques that they're using. It's quite fascinating, and it also, I think, is the best tool that I have accessible to me as a conservator, because it helps me understand even more about the object that I'm working with, or the group of objects that I'm working with.
Wonderful. Thank you. Sylvia.
Well, I think I'm going to touch on a little of what everyone else has said, because of course we all feel that oral histories and connection to the past and our network of colleagues are absolutely essential for doing our work. And I'll go back to the craft side with the tools. And who could forget the collection of tools that one gets and makes in graduate school, and the lessons that you learn from your first teachers. And I still have those tools, which in my peripatetic career, I haven't lost. And they mean a lot to me, because I know that the way that they were made, I learned from a master, whether it be a man or a woman. Often it was a woman. And that those take me back generations from people that knew and developed these crafts that are a big part of being a good conservator, knowing how to work with materials and having the right tool to do the right job. So I also hope to pass these on and do try to pass them on to my own students. And I think that legacy is very meaningful in our profession. We are a small profession, and I think we share these ideas, and they have a lot of value over time. In terms of a laboratory tool that has an unexpected value, people might be surprised, but actually the stereo microscope is something that I thought is a tool that I've used to really draw people in that come on tours to the Library of Congress. And I'm thinking in particular of some recent high school groups that came in to look at a manuscript that was actually a diary of a Muslim slave from the early 1800s. And I had put together materials that were used in the making of this particular object. And these high school students, they looked at what is the material used for making this ink? How was this paper made? What does that look like under this great magnification? And it was very real to them. It made this object very meaningful to them. I mean, the object was in Arabic. None of us spoke Arabic in that group, but the beauty of the writing and the material connection to this person, I know that they're going to remember that forever. And there's something about the microscope that just opens up that world to people that are not used to our profession. And I mean, if we think about the first time that we used it ourselves for looking at something, it's a remarkable tool. And then another very different tool that I like to point out in working with a collection like we have at the Library of Congress, which is very international, is language. Because being able to understand what you're looking at and being able to read it makes it tremendously meaningful for you as a conservator, and also informs you in how to approach it. And I'm thinking of two things in particular that once again refer back to our internship program. We accept a lot of international interns at the Library of Congress, and we had one time a tremendous Chinese rubbings project that had been left untouched for 100 years because everyone was afraid to tackle it. They were all folded up into these little squares. And we happened to have a Chinese intern that year who was able to read these antique texts, these texts that come from stones that have been rubbed so flat. now that you can't get that same image from them. So these rubbings carry the stories of that culture to us today. And we were just so lucky that we had this young woman who was able to really enrich this project for us and really for the whole library. And another project was similar, an Armenian scroll that had arrived in 1,000 pieces. And we have an Armenian speaking conservator on our staff who was able to help us put all of those little pieces of language back together so it's a whole. And the curator of this collection gets people to donate things to the Library of Congress specifically because he shows that they're cared for. And I think, you know, that's a big role that we try to fill.
Wow. You folks have really pulled it together. And in terms of themes, I'm hearing, especially I won't reiterate, but what I hear linking that is curiosity and openness and not assuming you have all the information. And that there are stories to be told, and we come to it from, we've been trained, and conservators, preservation folks have been trained with, you know, this object is useful, there is a reader, but we don't necessarily know who that reader is to be all throughout our future, right? And to bring in as much as possible. Before we go forward can sometimes limit us, right? We might not touch something for 100 years, but that might be okay. I mean, we don't want to not touch collections and make them accessible, but at the same time, you know, we have to go forward with the limited knowledge that we have. And I think just acknowledging that, for me, I would say one of my toolboxes is my judgment, you know, and it's not to be judgy, but it's to understand, do I have enough information to go forward? Where else can I seek input? You know, where are our stakeholders? Where is the community? And that is really starting to shape our community more and more. So thanks for that. I'm going to move on to our second question. So some of you mentioned individual mentors. Jan Paris's name came up, and thank you so much. I'm going to go back and reread that article because I'm searching for use and values things right now for discussions in-house as my own place re-examines what we're working on. So who and what do you think of when you think of women in preservation? I mean, some of you have mentioned that it's already a woman-dominated field in the demographics, but who are our leaders, or where could we have more leaders? Who's coming in? How can we make it more balanced and not, you know, a service library job, which is a lot of how people get into it. But we also have material scientists, we have architects, we have engineers, we have all these people who are interpreting stuff, data miners, and electronic record specialists. I mean, it's fascinating how this field is changing. So.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great question of sort of who are some of the people who have sort of led me on my journey, attracted me to oral history, and provoked really important questions for me about what is oral history, how do we practice oral history, how do we preserve oral histories. And there are a lot of women in oral history. Thinking about the field itself, the Professional Oral History Association, a lot of that started with men, particularly because it's coming out of the academy. And at that time in the mid-1900s, that was overwhelmingly men. But oral history at its core is something that everyone has practiced. And women have really shaped and informed the way that cultures practice oral history, and also the way that the field itself has grown in order to make sure that it focuses on everyone, not just the famous and the powerful. Some kind of key people who I think about, who I've looked at when I've explored oral history and the practice and the preservation of it, are thinking about Zora Neale Hurston and the Federal Writers Project. Also, Ruth Edmonds Hill, who's done a lot of work on recording and preserving African-American women's stories over the years. Susan Armitage, Sherna Gluck, who've talked about what feminist oral history is and the role that women have played in the field. Linda Shopes, Valerie Yao, talking about preservation, talking about thinking of an archive as something that is curated, that we're not able to collect everything, we're not able to preserve everything. And so really being mindful about what we are preserving and collecting, whose stories are included, whose stories may not have been included, and how we can change that. There are numerous people. And of course, as Renee pointed out earlier, for me, I have continuing mentors of people who are colleagues to me, who I continue to talk to and learn from. And I think that I will continue to learn as more people enter the field. And one of the places that I see some of these new mentors for me coming from are people with different abilities, in particular, the deaf community entering the sort of professional field of oral history, and really pushing the boundaries and asking questions of these practices we've developed of transcribing and translating oral histories, and how do we document language in the different ways that people choose to express themselves, in the words they choose, in the way that their signs are signed, and how do we document that not just in the recording, but in different ways and different sort of preservation methods in order to make those records more accessible to people in the future in different ways, and to create resources that not just oral historians and historians can use, but anthropologists can use, folklorists can use, linguists can use as well. So that's something that I think is starting for me to really influence my practice in the way that I think about preserving and making accessible oral histories in the archive.
Wonderful. Renee?
I think probably we all have similar stories about women who have mentored us. I think I'll kind of bounce my question from the quasi-present to the distant past to what I hope for the future. The quasi-present is when I was researching the conservation field, hoping to get into a graduate program. I always have, the first person who comes to mind is Sally Malenka, who is an object conservator at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. At the time, I was coming from a journalism background. I had no hesitations about interviewing people. So I asked if she would have lunch with me, and then I grilled her for 3 hours. She very generously answered my questions for 3 hours. And now looking back, I'm like, wow, would I ever give anyone 3 whole hours? But I'm so grateful that she did, because it was so much good information that I needed to know, and I was so hungry for it, and she gave it to me. So I always have deep gratitude for the time she spent with me that day. So I always have to give Sally a shout out. Going to the distant past, I mentioned that I'm interested in the history of collections care at the American Philosophical Society, and there are some important women in that history who have sort of guided the way the profession has grown. The first person that I always think of is Jane Aidkin, who was the daughter of Robert Aidkin, who was a printer and bookbinder in Philadelphia. During the colonial period, he was a Scottish emigre. He printed the first English edition of the Bible in what became the United States. And after his death in 1802, his daughter Jane took over his business as a binder and a printer. Unfortunately, she also inherited all of his debts. But she did a lot of work for the American Philosophical Society, as her father had done. So binding books, the routine collections binding of the library. And so she is an important figure. The next woman that I know of is Carolyn Roo, who became Carolyn Horton, who is an important figure in paper conservation and book conservation. She worked at the APS in 1935 and 1936 before becoming the first book conservator at Yale. And so she had studied with binders and restorers who were men, but she became a really important figure in training men and women going into the field later. So she was vitally important in training Paul Banks, who founded some of the preservation education programs later in the century. And so I really appreciate her history at the APS, and it's always really fun to open a book and see her little flag in the back that says she treated it. It makes me feel part of a long continuum with important players in it. And after her, there's someone that I know very little about, but is another female restorer working in the 1940s in Philadelphia, named Helen Price. And she also left flags in the backs of her books and worked at several local institutions. But she's a figure that I know very little about. I haven't been able to find very much about her. And I think that's something that the field in general grapples with, not only with former conservators that we know very little about, but all the sort of hidden producers of information and knowledge and wisdom in the past. We have evidence that they lived, they might be the tradesman in an account book, but we can't look back through time and tell whether they were a white person, a Black person, a brown person, how they contributed to this society, what their life was like. So it would be nice to be able to reveal more of those hidden voices. And I think that's something that we're all trying to do now. Mm-hmm. It ties in somewhat with what I hope for the future of the field and the women in the field, which is, I'm excited to see, as I said, that we're lowering some of the hurdles to training. And I think Shannon's probably going to touch on this more, but I had the privilege of working with Layla Huff as one of the first cohort of the Historically Black College and University Library Preservation Program, in which promising undergraduates from HBCUs are placed with libraries to learn more about the preservation field and potentially pique their interest in conservation. And Layla's interest was piqued, and it was thrilling to work with her and see her get excited about the field. So as anyone who works with interns or students knows, you get as much from them as they get from you, if not more. So those will be my mentors moving forward, is the people that I'm helping to train who come from a different perspective and have different knowledge that can really enrich and inform my own practice.
Wonderful. I think we are touching on a lot of subjects. We might drop our third question, but I want to continue this incredible discussion about how we are using determination and passion, who we think of, and how we're changing the field. So I'm going to invite our panelists to carry on with this same question. Shannon, who do you, how may that change?
Sure. So I, like all of my other esteemed colleagues on this panel, I have been very fortunate to have wonderful mentors. And as Sylvia mentioned, since conservation is a relatively young field, I've had the great fortune of being mentored by trailblazers in the field, at least in the field of photograph conservation, because photograph conservation is one of the younger specialties. And that is something that I truly value. And now that I'm colleagues with these same individuals, I feel as if I am still learning from them. I'm still in contact with them. Many of my professors at the Winter University of Delaware program, which I also went to, like Renee did, I keep in contact with them quite frequently on email with them or Zoom calls now, since we can't see each other in person. But I like to think about, aside from my conservation mentors, people who were not necessarily in the conservation field, but maybe in allied professions or not even in conservation at all, that helped me get to the path that I'm on. Most of them are women. And I think back to when I was a student in undergrad, I went to Spelman College, which is a historically Black college, an HBCU. And two of my earliest mentors were actually archivists. One was Taronda Spencer, who was the former archivist at the Spelman College Archives. Unfortunately, she's passed on, but she was the first college archivist. And even though Spelman has this very rich legacy and rich history, it'll be 140 years old this year. They didn't have their first real archivist until the 90s. And she did a tremendous amount of work to preserve and protect that collection, and was constantly mentoring students, even students that didn't necessarily work in the archives with her, because she had a group of student workers, and that's one of the work study jobs you can have as an undergraduate student. But even folks like me, because I didn't work directly under her, I worked under another archivist named Karen Jefferson, who was at the library for the Atlanta University Center, where Spelman is based. And I would go in and talk to Miss Spencer and ask her questions and just kind of pick her brain, kind of like what you did, Renee, just like asking questions about, what you do and the meaning of it and all of these things, and just watching her work and understanding this concept of preserving things, and not, you don't know what the future, what future scholars will want. And you can't keep everything, but being very selective and having a good understanding of, the things that may be important, or even if they aren't things that you don't necessarily know of as important or think of as important, trying to let go of the biases that you may have around certain types of objects or cultures or what have you, and recognizing that there are stories that have been historically excluded, and you have to do something to bring those stories to the forefront. And so I would say those folks that I worked with early in my career, who I still have, in some instances, rely on just to catch up with or for advice, those are folks that I say, those are definitely my mentors. But I think going forward, all of the new folks coming into the field, whether it be conservation or archives or just preservation in general, they have such a different perspective that is very important, and I think revolutionizing the field, to be honest. And I'm so glad to know that we're finally at a point where we can have space for these voices. Though I think there's still work to be done. I think we still need to do more of that work as a field to really let go of biases and what a conservator or what an archivist looks like, or who is allowed to work on these materials or what have you. But I think that we're working towards that, and the stories that we will be telling going forward, I think, will be more inclusive and more reflective of the rich culture that we have here in the U.S. and beyond.
Thanks so much, Shannon. I think that you're driving home also a really amazing point, is that most preservation is done by simple actions and complex actions by archivists and caretakers, people who have held and arranged or held on to these precious materials that they think are precious for a good amount of time. We have actually a question in the chat that I'll be addressing afterwards to help that along, but I'd like to get to Sylvia.
Okay, I think the grandmother on this panel, when I went to conservation school, the leaders in the paper field were women in all of the institutions. And I'm thinking of course, Anne Clapp at Winterthur, who was very instrumental in getting the profession to be recognized as an equivalent to paintings or sculpture conservation, which had a much higher profile at the time. And I believe she worked as a conservator into her 80s and was really a mentor to so many students. And even those of us who didn't go to Winterthur had a chance to read her books and know about her background. And in my program, of course, I already mentioned Caroline Keck, the director, who was really a pioneer in the field of conservation in general as a paintings conservator, and a woman from a very humble background who really made it to the absolute top and was an extremely powerful figure. Kind of intimidating for a student, but in retrospect, the things that she taught us were really important, because at the time, 5 men and 5 women were accepted into our program at Cooperstown. It was always like that. And, we were sometimes a little intimidated, but she just got us to stand up and speak for ourselves, and required quite a lot of interaction with the community, with the public speaking, outreach. She was all for that from the beginning. And for some of us who hadn't done that before, coming from different backgrounds, it was really a valuable lesson. When I got to the my first mentor, I should say, before school was a lovely woman in San Francisco, Pauline Moore, paintings conservator, who really encouraged me and had been a Cooperstown grad. And so I kind of leaned in that direction. And she was so, in her quiet, very skillful way, impressive to me that I wanted to go back and learn more from her after school, because in those days, we didn't have quite such a long preschool requirement. There were fewer of us. So I don't even know whether we'd be able to tackle the system for getting into school now. As I really admire these young students who prepare so much before they are accepted. But anyway, another important woman in the paper conservation field was the first paper conservator at the Library of Congress, Margaret Brown, who retired about 10 years ago. She started in the early 70s, knowing nothing, was completely apprenticeship trained, and ended up being very influential in having conservators involved in the exhibition program. In other words, before that, things were put on exhibit, whatever condition they were in, because there wasn't a system for examining things and seeing what was necessary. And that has made a huge change in how things have lasted, because things that are overly loved, we know, get consumed. So she was a mentor in that way. And in her retirement, another really valuable thing that she had to offer was she knew the early history of all of the structure of the department, and she knew early projects, and we had a lot of papers that none of us had any connection to, that she was able to come back and put in order and interpret. And that is so valuable when you think of the Library of Congress as such a huge place. And if we don't take care of our own history in our own department, that thread is broken and all that information is lost. So she just gave a lifetime of effort to it. And I think of other conservators in our field who've done the same, like the director of our National Institution organization, Peggy Ellis, who is both a professor, a teacher at the school, a conservator at a number of institutions, and she is the leader of our national organization that has had to go through so much evolution with the digital age and with the expansion of our community. And I just think that she's really a terrific role model and leader, and has been, very influential in the field. So, okay.
Yeah, I was getting.
I know we're moving on.
Anyone? I think we are going to skip that third question because we've really touched on it a lot. But for those who are curious, what was that question? To serve, preserve, and protect the past, how are we doing at it? And I think everyone's touched on the fact that we were trained to do it one way, but with the tools and academia or certain expectations of the past. But we had also come from somewhere else where there were different routes to coming into this apprenticeship training, people coming in from different fields, and people who were barred from that in certain ways, whether it was a quota system, at Cooperstown, or by dint of, education funneling. So moving on that, I really want to honor our folks in the question box. I've answered one on basically how best to preserve that family letters and deeds, and I shouted out our colleagues at National Archives and Records Administration with a link to NARA.gov preservation for that. And let's go to our first question about futurism. How have tools changed? Have you started? And what's on the forefront of the profession going forward? And try and keep it short. We've got a few.
So for oral history, of course, tools have changed greatly from reel-to-reel tape to cassette tape to currently born digital oral histories. And that's something that for the field is really interesting and has been a great benefit to all of us in terms of making oral history more accessible to people, but it also requires different things, like it requires computers or audio recorders or memory space and archive space, and it demands oftentimes a lot more on archives and their resources in terms of continuously opening and resaving files in order to make sure that they last a long time. But the interesting thing too that I have experienced with the pandemic is archiving oral histories done remotely, and how archives that felt very rigid in their standards and their practices beforehand have adapted and been great at releasing some of those standards and allowing people to just record however it's possible to them at the best standard that they can in order to get the stories of now. And that's something that I think is really important, and something to keep in mind for preservation in general, is that we do have standards, but they can always be negotiated. And the most important thing is to record and include stories that we wouldn't otherwise have if we made sure that everything was that sort of top tier perfect standard that we oftentimes want it to be.
That's great. I mean, we are certainly in the libraries and archives field, we are the recipients of whatever somebody chose to save, and we're not always responsible for its condition. So perfect can be the enemy of the good there. Any other thoughts on changing tools going forward? I think a lot about coding. There's a lot of data mining and analysis that's happening, and there is a lot of mapping that's happening. You know, ArcGIS has been, and the open source democratized tools that are available for constructing maps and telling stories that, you know, I can think of. There's a historic redlining project in DC that was established by archivists and preservationists, you know, trying to find information and using archives and using, to influence preservation, right? Preservation in the larger field is so much based on records. And if certain records weren't kept or organized or taken care of, you have to reconstruct those records somehow. And so there's a lot of data science that's becoming incredibly useful in the preservation field in terms of, you know, back analyzing all these in the digital humanities, of course. You know, we're getting things up online in digital programs, and people can really look at that information and start building characteristics and stories about what is missing from our archives. You know. Moving on to the next question. Fabulous conversation. The work that you all do is so important. Is there a specific project that you're a part of that you're most proud of? And a couple of you have mentioned them. Anybody else?
I think proud of is maybe not the thing that pops to mind foremost. As a conservator, I get excited about every project, even the ones that are just tedious, you know, surface cleaning, you know, essentially erasing marks off of paper, taking dirt off, mending. These are things that can take hours upon hours of the same kind of labor over and over. But the feeling of satisfaction you get from a job well done, I think conservators have a high tolerance for tedium when they can see progress and be proud, yes, of the result that they get. But it doesn't usually have very much to do with the item itself, if that makes sense. The things that I get most excited about working on are things that present an interesting challenge and require me to do some unusual problem solving in getting to a good result. So recently, I worked on a book, a very large book that was essentially the leaves of it were joined together like an accordion, even though it was a Western book, not an Eastern book. And I ended up having to re-sew it using a chair as my sewing frame because a traditional sewing frame would not accommodate the book structure. So that was pride isn't necessarily what comes to mind, except that, it was an interesting challenge and I was able to solve it. If I had to solve it again, I'd probably try to do it even better next time.
And innovation, creativity, challenge. Fantastic. For someone interested in preservation, what is the one thing you know now that you wish you knew when you were starting out?
I think always being prepared to kind of be a lifelong learner, recognizing that even though it may feel like in graduate school, you're learning everything that your brain could possibly handle, they are really just giving you a basic toolkit from which you are able to make sound decisions. But knowing that throughout your career, there are things you're just not going to know. And you're going to have to do research. You're going to constantly be doing research. And it's okay to say, I don't know the answer to something. And that is something that I feel, especially as folks coming into the field and maybe even starting their first job or fellowship opportunity post-graduate school, it's harder to kind of reconcile with that. But now, once you get past that, I think it's a little bit easier. I would say, I don't know, I'm not a senior level conservator, but I would say now that I am, almost 6 years post-grad school, which is not that much, but still a quite a bit of time post-graduate school, I feel much more comfortable with that now than I did when I first finished. So I would say that's my biggest thing that I wish I had known earlier.
And Shannon, it doesn't stop even after 36 years or however long it's been. I graduated in 1982. I find that you learn continually. And that's one of the exciting things about our profession is there's always something interesting going on, some new interesting project, a person that teaches you to look at something in a different way, appreciation for what has been collected and has been kept and what you can learn from it, something new all the time. And I guess maybe that's what I would tell a person coming into our profession, that it is something that will engage you and satisfy you and enrich you and stretch you for all of your life.
We have a big question addressed to Shannon, but anyone can take it as well. How can we make the conservation field more inclusive and promote diversity in all the specialties? How do we continue this journey of changes in social justice? It has been, the pandemic has been very devastating for BIPOC community and conservators in private practice.
Yes, and it's truly unfortunate that one of the things, despite us being so much more connected via virtual reality and Zoom and whatever, we are still we're still disconnected. And I would say because conservation is a field where you really hands-on work is so imperative and you have to do it. I think those in-person internships and opportunities that may have existed prior to the pandemic and been accessible for people who, have to have a paid internship opportunity, they can't volunteer or whatever. Those things, I'm sure there's been a shift in that. But I would say, above all of it, making the profession more visible to people and just letting people know that it exists, bringing this awareness to what it is that we're doing, and then creating opportunities. I mean, that's one thing at the Smithsonian. We're a large institution, so we have internship opportunities for students or undergrad or even grad students, but smaller institutions can create those opportunities as well. I think thinking differently about that and how that will work. Funding, of course, is something that we're always in search of, but figuring out a way to bring awareness to the field, to get people in, to have the opportunity, and creating that infrastructure for them once they're in the institution. Because I think that the thing that I see as problematic or challenging is bringing people in the door, but not really having the workplace be a safe space for them. And that's something that I think we need to work on. So I don't have any like concrete ideas on how to make it better, but I think continuing to open doors and make things accessible for people.
And unless anybody else has anything to say, I think that sums it up. We are at time. Please, thank you so much. This has been such a pleasure on my part. I would be remiss if I did not also shout out a couple of things. The ATALM, the Association of Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums, has grown from a tiny grassroots conference to a full conference now. And that is an amazing way to get involved throughout the country as well. And I also want to mention Apoyo. Apoyo Online has it's an association for North American and Latin American preservation and conservation, and that they celebrated the 30th anniversary recently, which I did not realize at their last conference. So I think of those people as well, Beatriz Haspo and Amparo Torres. Those were names coming up, and I had that Anne Clamp book. That was one of my first books in preservation. So there's a long continuum. I thank you all so much for your time and the audience for the questions. We can probably continue getting to them in offline chat. And I invite you to stay tuned after the break, part 2, Safekeeping tomorrow with one of my former mentors and continuing mentor and friend, Janice Stagnino Ellis. Thank you all so much for your time.